many, the story of the First World War home front is one of unity, a nation pulling together, driven by a shared sense of duty and patriotism. But was that really the case? In For King and Country, Richard Batten offers a rather different picture, one where patriotism is not simply felt but enforced, where local elites act as superintendents of patriotism, I like that phrase, shaping how people should behave and judging those who fall short. Using Devon as a case study, Richard explores recruitment, social pressure and the tension between national expectations and local realities. What emerges is a home front that is far more complex and at times far more divided than we might expect. So in this episode of Oh What a Lovely Podcast, we're going to explore what patriotism actually looked like on the ground. Richard, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
The book challenges the idea of a united home front. I wonder how strong is that traditional narrative which you're tackling? Why has it remained pervasive?
I would say it's remained pervasive, possibly as a byproduct of the centenary, really, because the fact is it seemed to be very much when, during the centenary period, a lot of people locally were trying to find out, what did our local community do? And so you got a sense of how local communities, like for instance in Bridport, there was a movement to try and create netting for the fishing fleets, and at the same time Churchill had talked about the idea of using netting from Bridport to be able to capture submarines, to be able to try and fish that. And so a lot of local history groups as well as other interested individuals tried to be able to find out what happened in our local communities, and so the idea of what did individual localities, whether it's villages, towns, hamlets, what did we do to be able to help support the war effort? And so it became a kind of a tapestry of a kind of like, this is what the home front did. What I found with the research, and in particular what the archives were telling me through the research, is that actually the home front is a lot more complicated in the sense that people did object to what were deemed to be expectations and traditional obligations.
Given the content of the book, I like the idea of like people in the centenary period sitting down going, let's find out what Grandad did during the war, and then going to the archives like, turns out Grandad told the recruiter to go to hell.
At which point there's an element of self-censorship on the local populace to only portray the war in a manner that they would like the war to be portrayed.
Very much so. It seemed to be very much like, this is a kind of like a comfort narrative, as it were, and it did kind of go against the grain in terms of what I found in the archives. So, for instance, in one recruitment rally in Cornwall, I thought it typified a lot of response from the actual eligible young men to the elderly figures or ineligible figures, telling them to go and enlist, in the sense of one elderly figure is saying, it's up to the young men to be able to fight for Britain, and yet the young men are saying, well, why can't the pensioners go off and fight? Why can't they go off and do their own thing, really? And so you get this kind of pushback in the sense of like, well, I'm being told this is what I have to do, but I'm not being asked, well, is this going to be okay, really? Because I've got traditional family responsibilities at home, whether it's farming or for fishing or other respective trades. And this kind of like this push and this pressure from ineligible figures kind of becomes ever present. And so I think that's why a lot of these eligible men don't necessarily want to talk about recruitment, because of the fact that they're afraid that they could be mocked or criticised. And so some of the evidence was as well that, like, for instance, Richard Miles taking out his stick to be able to try and stop the army recruiter from enlisting his sons, in the sense, this is how I will serve you, whilst hitting the road, trying to get the recruiting officer to clear off. At the same time, some instances of like drunken disorderly behaviour, where one man was trying to stop army soldiers recruiting in the village of Hemyock. So there's some interesting bits and pieces, really, in the sense of like, oh, crikey, this is what's in the archive. I was at the Exeter Local History Book Festival, and there was a lady who told me that locally in, I think it's southeast Devon, that there was a family where a son had gained temporary exemption from conscription until the 30th of June, and the grandmother was beside herself in worry, because the fact is, what happens after the 30th of June? What's going to happen to the farm? Is everything going to be okay? And it didn't get included in the book, but I was surprised to hear that actually the grandmother was so beside herself with worry, she actually shot the grandson in his bed. And so she came out, she said, I've shot Bill. And it turns out that she was so beside herself with worry that she couldn't contain herself about the idea that Bill was going to get sent off if he after the temporary period of exemption.
When you say shot, is that synonymous with killed?
Indeed, yes. She'd got the shotgun and she shot him in his bed.
I'm not sure that's the solution she was looking for.
Oh, no, but in that sense, it was interesting how what you were saying, Chris, earlier about what you find out. Apparently, from what the lady told me, that apparently the family still feel shame to this day, really, about this kind of instance in their family history.
I find it quite interesting that you identify the centenary of the period that sort of embeds this idea, because it points to some of the disconnect between the academic history and the popular narrative. And I'm trying to remember when it was published, because Catriona Pennell's A Kingdom United and even Adrian Gregory's The Last Great War, they're both questioning this great national unity at the national level rather than the local level. And yet that appears to have made little or no impact. And one of the great hopes for the centenary, of course, from the academic perspective was, we're going to be able to bring these narratives, all this deep archival research that we've done that nobody's really listened to before, to a wider public. And yet it seems to have had absolutely no effect at all, which is unfortunate.
I think Adrian Gregory's book was published in 2008.
That one I can tell you because I've got it next to me on the desk. But no, it's Catriona's that I don't have to hand at the moment, because that's in my sort of historiographic knowledge, that's the moment that somebody came out and said, actually, we need to think again about this.
Oh, absolutely, yes. This idea that everybody acted in the same way, and really Catriona's work has been able to show that wasn't the case. The fact is that circumstances did dictate how people reacted in their own different ways, really. And like, for instance, Stephen Reynolds is hoping against hope that war isn't declared, and then hoping that sensible heads will prevail, but at the same time he realizes that actually it seems to be going that way, and it's going to be this mad idiocy of armaments that's going to cause this. No, I completely agree with you in the sense that unfortunately these works have not really gone as far in terms of as one would have hoped in terms of trying to be able to combat it.
I mean, it's the eternal question: how do we as academic scholars, a lot of people will turn around and say, oh, but it's so academic. And you're thinking, well, what more can we do? These are, because they're great stories in your book.
I think with like some of the pressure that the academics face in terms of trying to be able to get a greater sense of outreach is that I remember when I did my book for the Devon Record Society, I did speak to a couple of people who read it, and I said, oh, what do you think? And they said to me, oh, we did find it a bit hard going, Rich. We did find it a bit of a challenge. And I thought, well, I've got to try and see if I can make the book that's based on my doctorate a bit more accessible, really, and just hope in that sense that people aren't going to give up after 4 or 5 pages, really. And so that's what my hope was. At the same time, I think we've also got to, try to be able to, when we're talking to people about our research, is try and be able to make it in a way which isn't going to be so heavy on theory, to try and engage with actually things which are kind of commonplace in the sense of like individual priorities, in the sense of how people are struggling day to day, and kind of like how people bring up, oh, this is very similar to that period. And so we can create some links there and trying to be able to raise awareness of what we do in terms of our respective fields.
I mean, it's part of the problem that from a wider public perspective, they're like black and white. And when you talk about patriotism during the First World War, it meant different things to absolutely everybody. And it's quite striking when I was reading it, thinking about those local elites and how they viewed patriotism. And then I'm thinking, actually, what central government says can be a mixed message. So, certainly from 1916 is not about necessarily getting everybody in the army, but that's not necessarily what the local elites felt. It was all about getting men for the army. In fact, I was slightly intrigued because I can't quite picture in my mind in Devon, beyond the Royal Navy, what other industries there are rather than agriculture that was directly linked to the war effort? Because the mining's gone by the First World War as well, hasn't it?
It has, yes. And so you have got industries which are like, for instance, the fishing industry, where Reynolds is very keen to try and make sure he keep hold of as many men as he can, because the fact that after 1916 with conscription, he is concerned, well, he does admit that he doesn't want women taking on the role on the fishing boats because he doesn't want, he derogatorily describes them as suffragettes taking on the role of being able to do the fishing. And you've then also got shipbuilding as well in places like Appledore. At the same time, the holiday industry as well with Devon. You've got places like Ilfracombe, Sidmouth, Seaton, and Teignmouth and Exmouth. At the same time, Devon's also got fishing and as well as forestry as well. So there are a range of industries that are able to try and work with the war effort. But at the same time, like for instance, with lace making, Heathcote Amory tries to be able to convert half his factory to making munitions. And he is then facing as well the problem that his workforce is being depleted. But the committee of male lace hands doesn't want to have women working in the factory because they don't want to necessarily lose their jobs. And so you've got these different industries trying to figure out, okay, we're now under these new circumstances. What do we actually do to try and improve our patriotism, or how do we actually engage with the war effort?
And I always find that discussion interesting. I'm sure it's the Daily Mail that advertises that it's patriotic to order the Daily Mail as it saves on waste paper, which kind of is a wonderful sliding scale on how we can view patriotism in an extremely wide way.
Absolutely. I've found recently there's a record of in the Dawlish Tribunal, Angus, where the military tribunal is trying to be able to recruit a gravedigger. And he said that surely an older man can dig this grave, but the committee who are involved with grave digging saying, oh no, we need to be able to make sure it's 10 foot deep. Well, would you accept 8 foot deep? Not necessarily. And then the military representative says, well, a patriotic man would accept being buried at 6 foot deep. And so he's not successful. But at the same time, it's one of those things where it's interesting how these proponents advocate for patriotism and how they use patriotism in this kind of light, in the sense of like, I want to make sure I can get this man out of civilian life and into the army, and what kind of argument I'm going to use to try and help to support my cause to be able to get him out of grave digging and get him into the army.
There's only one form of patriotism for the military representative, that this man should be in the army.
When I was reading the book, I was wondering how much of it, of the kind of this kind of complicated relationship with what appears to be like various forms of imposed, sometimes from the inside, but a lot of it from the outside, patriotism, is a story about geography. Because obviously, you know, Devon is a long way from like the metropole, and you know, next door to Cornwall, which presumably there's kind of like, I don't know, waves of Cornish nationalism kind of coming over the border. How much of this is a sense of, this is nothing to do with us. We're miles away from all of these things that you care about, and we don't care about it.
Exactly so, Chris. I mean, the fact is that a lot of these men are articulating those kind of ideas. And I mean, Olive Hopkin describes in 1917, during a break during the haymaking, how one of the people she's talking to says, oh, it ain't a working man's war. And the fact is that they do tend to look at it as like a distant phenomenon. Well, the war's being fought over in France and Belgium. It's got nothing to do with us. The fact is that we need to be able to try and make sure that we keep a roof over our heads, that we keep money coming into the door. And it's interesting how in Barnsley, one army recruiter faces a woman who's making these same kind of arguments that, oh, it's got nothing to do with my husband, I don't really want to do involved. And then the army recruiter says, well, actually, this is how much he would get if he did enlist, how much he would get as a financial wage packet. And the attitude changes completely. She said, oh, do you think the war's going to last very long?
out of curiosity, is it just the military wage, or is the separation allowance part of that discussion at all?
I think with the reporting, Jessica, it did mention how the army recruiter was trying to put it as like a combined package, in the sense of how it's the wage as well as the separation allowance.
Well, no, it's just even the mention, because the separation allowance, of course, is an innovation at that point. Interesting evidence that it actually works.
It just goes to show, in the sense of how sometimes it's the way you're able to try and convince your kind of like a target audience to be able to understand where you're coming from and what you're trying to achieve.
I just know the separation allowance is, you know, a civil service or a government initiative. So you've got all the civil servants and ministers talking about what it's supposed to do. But really interesting to have the evidence that, yes, it actually did change, particularly women's minds about what was going on. But just on that question of distance, what really struck me reading it was it's a local history. It's very much a local history. and having also read Angus's PhD, which is not yet a book and hopefully soon will be, Angus, I hope. But, that's asking very similar questions about a region at the other side of, diagonally opposite side of the country in North Yorkshire. I suppose my question is about how much you see this local history telling a national story.
I would say with what I was able to find out research-wise, like, for instance, the majority of the evidence I've got does contain evidence for Devon, absolutely. But at the same time, I was struck by how you've got the kind of like the ideas of armchair patriotism still evident across the United Kingdom. Like, for instance, in Bolton, this man taking it upon himself to be able to actually run his own roundup raid single-handedly, trying to be able to figure out, okay, all the people in this audience, I'm going to find out who is actually of military age. And at the same time, with like Atherstone, Mary Ellen Briggs taking down the recruitment poster. I mean, these kind of stories we haven't necessarily heard about in other histories, but I do think the evidence from Devon but can also shine a light on how people in like rural communities in England, as well as Scotland and Wales and Ireland, the fact is that there does seem to be very much ideas of like, well, we don't necessarily want the wall posters coming onto walls as well as trees that haven't had the local landowner given permission to be able to put up. And so I do think there's a story to be told in the sense of how people are not necessarily prepared to accept all that is being said. Oh, this has to be done in the name of the war effort. This has to be kind of, you have to just accept it. But some people are saying, well, actually, no, we don't necessarily want to have this kind of push from the top. We'd like to be able to engage in it on our own terms. And so for rural communities, I think there's more to be said, really, about what that kind of like pushback. And I think there's more to be said locally for that. I mean, I think as well in Kent, I do talk about how a man is charged for trying to confront a army recruiter saying that, why don't you go yourself? I think there's a lot to be said more for that kind of national kind of like, well, really, you're telling us to go, but why don't you go yourself? Really kind of pushback.
I do think that some of the different kind of competing local stories, some of the edges of them have become overly rounded off in an attempt to tell national stories, when actually they kind of, things like this jar very, very hard against some of the more kind of perhaps popularly held kind of notions of war enthusiasm and the like. And I don't even necessarily think it's just the First World War, because obviously, Lucy Noakes has written about in regards to the Second World War that, the concept of blitz spirit is a very specific time and place. Again, the example of the Second World War in Devon is very different to the example of the bombing in Coventry. And the idea that you can get a whole kind of cohesive national thing out of this, when actually there are really serious disjunctures and pushbacks in local communities.
Well, I wonder if the comparison is a rural versus urban split. And Angus, you might be able to talk a little bit more about that, because...
Well, I was saying you can push that further, because there's these very rural communities that are in the middle of nowhere, and they're turning around and saying, okay, well, we can put more crops in, but we haven't got we haven't got ploughmen. If you want to, you have to let young Johnny off because old Johnny's too old to operate the plough. Or would you like us to put sheep in, which we can, man? So there's a constant problems that these very remote rural communities have, which are, you see them in the North Yorkshire Dales, and they were very similar to those Dartmoor sort of questions of how would you like us to fight the war. They're mixed messages. You want wheat, we could do wheat, but we need these people, or we need that. How do you want us to fight it? So you have central government pushing for one thing, and then certain local people go, well, actually, we need you in the army. Well, what do you want? How do we solve this?
Absolutely. And so you've got the kind of like people on the ground saying, well, actually, that's not feasible. Like, for instance, to introduce the tractor, even though the tractor in the First World War wasn't as efficient compared to the Second World War. At the same time, like in my part of the world, I mean, the fact is it's more during the First and the Second World War, it's more a question of trying to be able to get reliability of labour. And so with, like, for instance, with like the land girls coming along, some farmers are saying, well, I've got to train up some of these women because the fact is they're not necessarily as well trained as I'd like them to be. And so in the Second World War, trying to be able to get them to be able to do ploughing with tractors. And then in the First World War, there's this kind of like amazement in Devon in the sense of like, what are these city women going to do? Really, I mean, Mary Lees talks about this when she's trying to reverse a trailer with the horse and the cart. And so the old farmers are like watching amazement on their sticks, really just watching, really seeing how she's going to do it. And so there is that disconnect between what's feasible and practical locally, as well as what central government and local government want the populace to do. And so you get these kind of like this conflict between the two.
Even the military from 1915 have been told not to recruit agricultural workers because they could be useful, yet they continually decide that this man should be in the army. This man is more use in the army.
Oh, absolutely. And so you get the kind of pressure from like local councils, like for instance, Honiton, because of the amount of hauling that they're doing with the actual timber that's being transported to the ports to be able to take the wood over to France to be able to help build, repair and build trenches. And the roads are left in an awful state because of how heavy this cargo is. Yet at the same time, the men who are working these roads are a good source of recruits. And so the local council is saying, well, actually, we need to try and keep hold of as many road workmen as possible. But at the same time, they're also being asked as well to do extra work. So the Honiton is asking, can we let these men go off and do the harvest?
Coming back to because the tractor comes up in your book, and it kind of in a way that I found quite amusing, of like, all these farmers looking at this tractor going, that's rubbish. It's not reliable. It's not going to do anything. It's no good. But simultaneously, at the same time, you've got a bunch of military guys looking at the tractor going, we can make a weapon out of this. This looks fantastic. And you get the divergence of tractor turns into tank, but at the same time, farmers looking at tractor going, what's the point of it? It doesn't work.
Indeed, yeah. And at the same time, it's leaving our fields in such a state because it's just churning up the ground. It's not going to be productive in terms of how it's leaving the field. And so, yeah, absolutely, people are seeing things differently based on their own individual circumstances.
How much do you think it's a particularly Devonian war culture that the elites are trying to impose? If you try to spill into the surrounding area or national, I'm not sure what the national features of Devon are, to be honest. Other than ice cream.
Well, you've got, like, for instance, Devon seems to be defined through its landscape. So, for instance, you've got a lot of people associating it with Dartmoor, it's seaside, and at the same time, North Devon gets kind of like this idea of like it's a rural idyll. At the same time, it's also defined through its past. So you get people saying, well, look, actually, Devon rose to the fore because of what men like Sir Walter Raleigh, Francis Drake came to the forefront when England needed them to be able to defend against the Spanish Armada. And so you get this kind of like a sense of pushing that basically, look, Devon stepped up when England needed her. This is a similar time. We need Devon to be able to stand up for what is right, to be able to defend the nation. And another way in which the local elites tried to be able to get the Devon population to try and understand, look, this is your war as well as the rest of the UK at the time. So it's also defined through its dairy industry, and at the same time it's agricultural produce, so clotted cream of Devon because of the dairy industry, but at the same time it's also Devon apples as well because you've got the cider. And so in that sense you get this kind of amalgamation of different sources to try and say, look, this is all part and parcel of this war culture that's being pushed to try and mobilise and rouse the people to say, look, this is your war as much as anybody else's.
To what extent did the elites themselves perceive themselves as Devonian, first and foremost? I'm just thinking, I'm working on the interwar period and the sale of the great landed estates, and this increasing sense that land ownership was moving away from the region where the land actually was. And I'm just wondering, to what extent is that happening during the war, or did these elites really see themselves as first and foremost Devonian and sort of national figures, particularly the really high elites, not the yeoman stock necessarily, but...
Well, a key contender for that would be, Jessica, in my view, would be Earl Fortescue, because he sees himself very much as a Devonian through and through. He's very aware of the actual past of the family because of the fact that his ancestor was a Lord Lieutenant of Devon during the Napoleonic Wars. And so when he comes to write his memoirs of his war years, he's very aware and conscious of the fact that he is following in the footsteps of what his ancestor did. And so this is how he is able to make his own mark on the family history. And so he does see himself as linked to his own estate in Filly, so North Devon. But at the same time, he's also very keen on trying to be able to promote himself as like offering wartime leadership and trying to be able to emphasize his Devonian credentials. And so he's very keen to be able to say, look, the fact is that I'm a landowner, I'm a social leader. I'm going to try and see if I can try and help be able to keep up these Devon links. And in 1914, he is very keen on getting a Christmas card for the Devonshire Regiment sent out, and it includes the song, the start of the song of Uncle Tom Cobley and all. So that is then sent out to try and boost up. This is the sense of like, this is a card for Devon men fighting in the Devonshire Regiment. And so he was very keen to put his face to that, as well as the iconography of the Devonshire Regiment badge, as well as Royal Navy ships. And so he's very keen to try and stress his Devonian roots. In the interwar period, it's not something I'm afraid I've covered in too great a depth, I'm afraid.
That's where my research is at the moment. And it's that disconnect between, that Angus is pointing to with the knowledge of the land and how it's worked at a very local level, which is increasingly, it's happening over the 19th century already, but it then accelerates massively after the war. It's happening in the 1880s. But it's just that sense of the way in which that local identity is mobilized for a national war effort is really interesting.
It's also an interesting example of a situation that a lot of the other European powers try to solve with national service. The idea that, yes, people around France are going to identify with their own French region, but they also need to identify with France. We don't even know if they speak French until we bring them here and we train them in the military and we train them in Frenchness and, similar to what the Germans did. But we don't, because obviously Britain doesn't have that, any form of national service. So you kind of miss out on almost like a national education of citizenship or citizenry.
But the military's always been rooted in the regional as well, because that's David French's point about the regimental system and the, coming out of the militias of the Napoleonic era, that it's about your local community and defending your local community. So there's a really interesting tension, I think, going on in Britain that your book is bringing out, that between the local and the national at that level. There's
an interesting front cover because there was a book about Cornwall in the First World War, and the actual front cover contained a postcard that a illustrator did for the DCLI, the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, and it's actually the Kaiser holding onto a pasty, and the actual Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry soldiers coming out of the pasty as kind of like this Trojan horse pasty, but at the same time the DCLI are coming out to kind of like capture the Kaiser, like a scene from Gulliver's Travels.
I'm slightly coming back to my question about popular interest, because there are all these books about, they're still, it's a way in which I think popular history publishers publish the histories of the regiment. And I'm very aware when I go and give talks to various WFA, in particular WFA groups, they are regionally identified. And I'm wondering if there's a challenge for us as historians to make that, people are interested in their local history, in their regional history, in their family history. How do we then say, and this has a wider national relevance or not, as the case may be? So we may be in the similar position of some of the elites of saying, how do we make ourselves how do we make the local relevant without really annoying people?
Absolutely. Just trying to be able to find the right way of being able to engage with the target audience. Absolutely. Because I remember I was thinking to myself, do I include, because when I was getting the book ready, there was one anecdote I thought, do I actually include it? And it was actually Mrs. Simmons in Totnes deciding to plant potatoes in the unused plots of Totnes Cemetery. And I thought to myself, is this relevant? But then I spoke to a few people and they said, actually, Rich, that's very interesting in the sense that kind of brings home in the sense that the urgency of what was needed in terms of food production, and the Bishop of Exeter only reluctantly agreed on the condition that David ate shrew-bread. And so it's those kind of, I suppose, vignettes help to actually stick in people's minds, because the fact is I had another talk where somebody wanted to know more about, but the eggs that were donated to the war effort, how do they transported from Devon over to here? Were they air conditioned? That kind of thing.
But then it's a question of, can you get someone living in Yorkshire to be interested in what's going on in Totnes in the war?
if patriotism, it's contested, isn't it? So where's it been negotiated? In the North Rider, you can see it's negotiated at the tribunals by looking at the tribunal papers. I'm not sure the tribunal papers exist for Devon. But is patriotism being negotiated in the local press, or is the local press imposing what it feels patriotism is?
I would say it's a bit of both, Angus, because the fact is you've got people who are very keen with the newspapers to state that this is your patriotic duty, this is the patriotic duty of eligible men to go off and fight, even the South Devon Weekly Express in respect to eggs is putting this prescription saying that surely the residents won't be so unpatriotic to give over their eggs, in the sense that surely this is a small sacrifice to make, to actually give over one's eggs, really, for the sake of the war effort. Indeed, it's also being negotiated in places like for recruitment meetings as well as discussions. I mean, the fact that we've got, like, Reynolds is talking about superintending patriotism and how these figures are going around superintending the patriotism and they believe it's their patriotic duty. And so John Loosemore going around trying to enforce patriotism and then calling people who don't necessarily agree with him contemptible cowards. And that led to him getting into a physical altercation with Robert Passmore Jr. And so you get these kind of vignettes that really kind of bring home in the sense of how people are talking about patriotism over their breakfast tables, reading the newspaper, but at the same time during recruitment meetings, at the same time in other instances where people are meeting to talk about the war effort, in the sense of, oh, don't you think it's a bit much, in the sense that we're being told we can't really export our wool because there's a ban on it. And so you get these kind of conversations taking place that help to kind of like shed light on the ideas of patriotism being discussed and the discourses. I
don't know how critical the newspaper is. David Silbey writes about the working class patriotism and how they can now read by this point, so they get a lot of ideas of patriotism for the papers. I'm not sure how much the papers are actually all singing from the same hymn sheet, as opposed to having a wider discussion on whether a blacksmith in somewhere or another should go compared to a blacksmith somewhere else, or do they just think everybody should be in the army?
I think it's more of a case of how, like, since Devon has got one of the lowest recruitment returns in the whole of the whole of England, it kind of like is a shocking kind of development that leads some newspapers to say, well, if some men are saying, well, we ain't going until we be fetched, then it kind of like leads to a sense of like exasperation, the sense of how dare you say something like that, considering we are fighting a war and this is a war which we could technically lose. And so it just seems to be more with the newspapers a sense of like, no, we've got to try and get through to people that this is what their patriotic duty is for eligible men to say these kind of things. I mean, even John Bull has a kind of like an article where it cannot believe a farmer would say that he's not prepared to send his sons off to go and fight. And yet when the army recruiter says, well, don't you care about your women and children? And he said, well, I'll be dead before then. They've got to look after themselves. And so these kind of episodes kind of bring forth the kind of like the sense of like, what planet are these people on? Really, they should be trying to think about this is a war we're fighting, and this is the obvious duty.
And presumably the editors of the local press would be part of the elites anyway, who are, part of your patriotic enforcers.
Absolutely, yes, because James Owen, he's the mayor of Exeter from the end of 1914 onwards, and he's also a newspaper conglomerate, and so he is very keen to try and stress it is the patriotic duty of eligible men to go and fight. And he even has in his window in his office, he's got, I think, Kitchener's poster of your country needs you, but yet the fact is he was very keen to try and, because of his civic responsibilities, to try and say, look, Exeter is playing its role. It is going to live up to the motto that the city has, its Latin motto of Semper Fidelis, of always faithful. And yet there were two men, when they saw the poster in his office, they said, let the buggers want. And so this caused Owen to use them as an example, but it was more of a case of him trying to push through his newspapers, but at the same time through his speeches and addresses when he's the mayor of Exeter.
It would be fascinating to look at. I've never looked at the recruitment figures across the country to see how much they change, because certain parts of Yorkshire have very low recruitment figures. I wonder if your what we call low recruitment figures could actually be normal for agricultural areas, but when you compare them to some of the urban centres, they suddenly become low, because some of the urban centres had huge recruitment figures, because frankly joining the army was not necessarily the worst thing that they could do.
Indeed. I mean, you've got like places like Cornwall and Devon, as well as Dorset and Somerset. And so their recruitment standards are a lot better compared to Devon. But I think another reason, Angus, why there's this kind of like this stigma is that you've got projects that Devon's elite tried to be able to introduce, but unfortunately they fail. Like, for instance, they wanted to create a PALS battalion for Exeter, but that leads to such an abysmal failure that Owen believes it's a shame, and the fact that the male citizens of Exeter don't respond to this project as well as they would have hoped. And yet Owen's second attempt doesn't lead to success either, and this leads Fortescue, based on the bad experiences of Exeter's own, to say, well, actually, the PALS movement doesn't seem to have much success in Devon at all. And yet you've got places where, I mean, like with the north of England, where you've got the PALS battalions are very successful. Yet the fact is that some urban areas might not have the same level of recruitment returns compared to rural ones.
Yeah, it's fascinating. That PALS regiment was interesting, because I wondered what the environment had to be for a PALS regiment to function. So if you're trying to get men to join up together, do they actually have to be together? So if you looked at the PALS regiment, are they literally from the same industry? And actually Exeter doesn't have that same industry for men, so they're not joining up together. They're not like the stockbrokers joining up, or the linen workers,
all coming from the factory floor,
or the local factory football team. Going back to your point about the fishing, is there a willingness to join non-army branches? And I'm thinking particularly of the merchant marine here, but potentially the Navy as well. Is there more willingness, again, geographically, for the coastal populations to join than the agricultural populations?
Absolutely, yes. So with the naval communities in Devon, like for instance, there does seem to be more of a kind of like a natural inclination to join the Navy. And with like the fishermen, Reynolds tells them, well, I can't tell you what to do, but at the same time, I would advise you to go into the Royal Naval Reserve. And so then at least then you are then going to be where your skills would be best put to use, because you've got that naval experience. You can actually put that into the Royal Naval Reserve. At the same time, you've got, with the Army recruitment, Navy recruitment is a kind of like a key source of competition. And so you've got like the Navy, because Devon's got this naval past with figures like Drake and Raleigh, in the sense of trying to be able to push, in the sense of, look, this is where you're best placed, because Devon's have got the best kind of skill set to be able to go into the Navy. And I think one newspaper says about how Devonshire is holding up the British flag on the seas, because that's where it should be better placed. At the same time, with places like Devonport, you've got the Royal Navy base, and so they're going to the dockyards to be able to try and make sure that they're actually keeping repairs on the Royal Navy's vessels. And so some people would say that actually that's where we're going to go, because we're better off helping the war effort this way.
And was that accepted?
It was accepted for some people, but at the same time, for the army recruiters, they suspected that actually a lot of eligible men are just going to the dockyard as a way of trying to avoid getting recruited. And so they're kind of like, they're trying to escape under the Navy umbrella. And so this kind of like idea of this is where the eligible men are going. This is why we haven't got good recruitment figures, because they're going into the Royal Navy, or at the same time they're seeking an escape route going off to the dockyards.
Oh, yay for armed service rivalries.
I can't help feel that there's a great study to be done looking at military representatives during the First World War to see who they were and how they got to the positions that they took, because they are a very mixed bag of people.
Very much so, because you've got like people like Lieutenant Stirling, who acts as the military representative for the Devon Appeal Tribunal, who's very much kind of a figure who definitely wants to put his imprint on a lot of the tribunal proceedings, especially when after a speech is made with the Board of Agriculture saying that, look, we need men to be able to bring in the harvest, and somebody claps in the audience. And that leads him to go that the person who claps is not a patriotic citizen. So he's very keen to put his imprint on what patriotism is, and very much in the sense of like with this confrontation, he's very keen on saying, look, the fact is you've got a very disordered idea of what patriotism is. Patriotism is very much like trying to support the home side. Again,
in the book, there's a bit when they're talking about some of these military representatives on the tribunals, and there's one bit where they're all very self-congratulatory about how amazing they are. And the military representative carried out their duties in an admirable way. I'm reading from, given how far away from France he is, I bet he did. It's not the worst posting in the world, is it?
The military reps go in 1917, they become national service reps, but many of them were not even military men. Some of them are just people who put themselves forward, and they army take them on with a rank and send them to work. They could be, just local civic volunteers with some cash usually.
I mean, I've got another bit of evidence, unfortunately didn't get included in the book, where the military representative for Dawlish Tribunal has a go at the Newton Abbot Rural Tribunal because of the fact that Newton Abbot had given exemption to a market gardener. And the Dawlish Tribunal representative, military representative, said that the sooner that Newton Abbot Tribunal is reconstituted, the better. And yet, when the Newton Abbot Tribunal hear about it, that the tribunal chairman says, well, actually, I think that the military representative for the Dawlish Tribunal has a very disordered way of looking at things, that we are patriotic, that really he's got a very disordered view of things. And the fact is that if he really wanted to be patriotic, he might be a rich man, so he's better off actually sending his men who works in his pleasure gardens and other things off to actually work the farms where they're better needed.
Which always reminds me of my favourite Yorkshire recruitment story, which is, and I keep forgetting the name of the owner of Lotherton Hall, who sends his car to become a motor ambulance during the war and sends his chauffeur off to drive it. We have no record of what the chauffeur's opinion of this bit of voluntarism was.
Well, have we come to our natural finish?
I think that rather nicely illustrates just how disunited the kingdom perhaps was if two military representatives can't agree on what patriotism is.
Which is a very kind of refreshing look at, because it does rather, there's lots of parts of this book that puncture kind of concepts of national unity and war enthusiasm, all those assorted things.
Next time, Chris, I think we're looking at...
it's Agatha Christie, The Mysterious Affair at Styles.
No, it's Seven Dials Mystery.
Oh, that's it. It's Agatha Christie, The Seven Dials Mystery. Or I've watched the wrong thing.
I've watched it twice and read the book.
I mean, we could talk about The Mysterious Affair at Styles. But...
Yeah, no, I have watched the right thing.
Which is the first one with Poirot and is set during the First World War, isn't it? Mystery at Styles.
Yes, I think it does fall during the war.
Well,
yeah.
Richard, thank you for joining us, folks. Richard's book is For King and Country. Well worth picking up from Pen and Sword.
So that does make it sound like buying it is a patriotic duty, which is not the worst advert in the world.
Thanks a lot. We'll see you everybody next time out.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.